Lae'l Hughes-Watkins is the University Archivist for the University of Maryland in College Park. From 2013 to 2018, she served as the University Archivist at Kent State University, where her work included managing the Kent State May 4 collection that documents the 1970 campus shootings by the Ohio National Guard during the protests against the Vietnam War. She also launched the Black Campus Movement Project, an effort to document student activism and its impact on campus development in areas of curriculum, cultural activities, faculty, and admissions. She is the founder of Project Stand, the first of its kind collaborative effort among archival repositories within academic institutions across the country to create an online portal featuring analog and digital collections that document student activism that primarily focus on historically marginalized communities. In 2018, the consortia received a national leadership grant from the Institute of Museums and Libraries for $92,000 to host 4 symposia from 2019 to 2020, and I know that you were just in Chicago last weekend. Yeah, so I think that was the 3rd, and there's one more, right?
Yep.
So they're in the midst of that, so thank you for coming back to Illinois. The seminars bring together archivists, technologists, educators, and activists, and will be live streamed and recorded for remote participants. It will result in the development of educational resources for curating activism archives, a white paper outlining the next steps, and a broader network of collaborators for the STAND network. This year, Project STAND was recognized by the Council for Society of American Archivists at the annual conference for its contributions to the archives profession. Lae'l is a 2019 mover and shaker and received the 2018 Merit Award by the Society of American Archivists for her leadership in Project STAND. Her research focuses on outreach to marginalized communities, documenting student activism within disenfranchised populations, and utilizing narratives of oppressed voices within the curricula of post-secondary education spaces. Her 2018 article, Moving Toward a Reparative Archive, a roadmap for a holistic approach to disrupting homogenous histories in academic repositories and creating inclusive spaces for marginalized voices, published in the Journal for Contemporary Archival Studies, remains one of the most popular papers in the publication. Lae'l just finished co-writing a chapter entitled Archives, Student Activism, and the Historian's Classroom, to be released by the Michigan State University Press in the fall, and will be working on a follow-up piece looking at Project STAND as a reparative archive model. So please join me in welcoming Lae'l.
Like, whoa, that's me. I'm going to take us on a little bit of a ride, so I hope everyone is ready and can buckle in and kind of go broad a little bit. But before I begin, first I would like to express my gratitude to the University of Illinois and the Student in Life and Culture Archives for this invitation to speak in front of you today on this most important occasion where you have gathered to discuss student activism, past and present. As our nation is currently in a unique moment, as your previous amazing and esteemed panel discussed earlier, tackling so many pressing matters from climate change, police brutality, transphobia, immigration, anti-Blackness, pay equity, women's rights, voter suppression, sexual violence. The list is long. The fight ahead seems terribly uncertain for sure. And yet one thing that remains constant is that change is built on the backs of our youth. Our young are asked to grab the mantle from the previous generation, which has been said earlier today. They are asked to pick up where our elders have left off, to run the leg of a race that seems infinite, where the wins may seem small, the accolades are few, but the danger, as you all know, is real. And the lives you save you may never know or meet, but our youth push ahead until it's time for them to pass on the mantle. Every name in the race for justice is not always known. It doesn't always make it onto the wall of fame, the page of a manuscript, a tweet, a speech, a memorial. And while youth are the recipients of whatever successes are made from the generation before, they will also bear witness to our mistakes and of what we have chosen to ignore What failures remain? How do we ensure they can run that next mile? And as I think about that today with you, I wanted to begin my talk with this 2009 quote from Nelson Mandela. One of our challenges as we build and extend democracy is the need to ensure that our youth know where we come from. What have we done to break the shackles of oppression? And how have we pursued the journey to freedom for all? This is what the archives, my circle, are about. In the summer of 2013, I became the first African-American archivist at Kent State University. Yes. Thank you. The university, which along with other academic institutions across the nation, will soon commemorate 50 years since the Kent State shootings on May 4th, 1970. While I had yet to be born, many of you in this room can vividly recall where you were, what you were doing, your reactions, your emotions as the news spread around the country and even to the international community at large. The murder of 4 white students and the wounding of 9 others by what was an act of state violence by the Ohio National Guard. This violence was something that shook the foundation of the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War. The May 4 collection at Kent State is the most significant holdings of its kind on this subject matter, with several 100 linear feet, some of which is just boxes of correspondence. And a review of those records show an outrage against the students, to be for sure. Blue-collar workers who pushed for the American dream felt hippies and radicals had upended their lives. Much of this anger was falling along the lines of the generational gap. But so much of the archival record, it also filled with support. Flyers, posters of planned walkouts, campuses responding en masse to the atrocity of spilled blood under the umbrella of the anti-war protest, the right to assemble. Telegrams poured in from France, Wales, and South Africa, many joining in solidarity with the students and expressing their horror at what had taken place at a small college town in Ohio. The question of how could this happen has been the thesis of much scholarship in the aftermath of those deaths. This moment in history was a gut punch that said white bodies could also be casualties in America's imperialistic campaign. Ellen Mann, a local Kent area high school student at the time, would later lament killing 4 white students, 4 white kids, was enough to stop the entire anti-war movement. The same violence that took the lives of these daughters and sons on a grassy hill at Kent State was the same egregious violence, however, already taking place in Black communities at historically Black colleges and universities. South Carolina State University, the site of the Orangeburg Massacre of February 8th, 1968, began with nearly 200 students protesting locally regarding a segregated bowling alley, and resulted in the death of 3 Black students and the wounding of at least 34 young Black folks. Many of them who were mostly shot in their backs as they ran screaming and searching for cover as bullets flew into the crowd from highway patrolmen. 2 years later, and 10 days after the Kent State shootings, Jackson State, another HBCU, barely, and I said barely, made headlines when James Earl Green, a Black high school student, and Philip L. Gibbs, a junior at Jackson State, fell to their death after a hail of gunfire by local police officers. 400 bullets in 30 seconds. 12 students wounded. The bloodshed at Jackson State that occurred in the cover of night is often married with the anti-war movement, but the series of tragic events were tied to racial strife between the Jackson State students who were often targeted by white motorists as they crossed Lynch Street, the main thoroughfare for students going to class. The systematic murder and wounding of Black students at these institutions did not garner the national and international outrage, nor the hundreds of school closings, nor any immediate legislation to address state violence. Instead, we find scant news coverage and botched reports of students armed with weapons. This state violence would help propel a new surge of activism, however, that would lead many Black students to take the revolution into their own hands. History offers us the continuing dehumanization of Black bodies and the continuing capitalistic valuation of Black peoples is grounded in slavery. Sharifa Rhodes Pitts, an author and historian, wrote in the New York Times piece, "The Worth of Black Men, From Slavery to Ferguson," on her discovery of archival documentation in a collection from a North Carolina slave trader, who ironically also considered himself an abolitionist, records on the value of Black slaves. One column read, ages year old, and in the other column, valuation. Ages range from 1 to 60 years of age, and the valuations range from $100 to $900, with 20 years old being the peak of value. Sometimes 20-year-old slaves could be valued as high as $1,600. Rhodes Pitts reminds us that the slave trade emphasized the importance of Black bodies at the market, not unlike the New York Stock Exchange. With the passing of the 13th Amendment in 1865, Afro-diasporic peoples remained as commodities to be viewed in the profit margins and therefore marginalized. And as white supremacist infrastructures and attitudes continue into the 21st century, Black bodies remain as something that merely appreciates and depreciates. This observation plays out in the school to prison pipeline in inner city schools and with hyperincarceration, which gives way to free labor as evidenced in The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. The humanity of Black people, as Rhodes Pitts suggests, will remain a struggle to assert because this country has and continues to thrive on its denial. The unfortunate truth is in direct correlation to why the tradition of oppressive practices within the archival profession and mainstream institutions continue to persist. People of color are routinely viewed as being void of humanity, and therefore we have nothing worthy of preserving. Our bodies are not worth keeping, our narratives are not worth preserving, our communities are not worth preserving. And as a consequence, within the halls of the academy, the voices of the disenfranchised are dehumanized, are victims of erasure or silenced within the historical record. But on the occasion where records exist within the repositories of colleges and universities, they are buried within the unprocessed collections that are forgotten or often ignored. Forgotten because they do not align with processing priorities, if the institution has not created a vision for an archive whose leadership understands the necessity of reparative justice, like the amazing worker you have here with Miss Jessica Ballard, who's doing amazing work in the archives here to bring out stories like the 500. But if you don't have someone like her or others who see reparative justice within an archival framework, then it will not include advocacy and intentionality for creating inclusive, equitable spaces that reflect the society that exists. As a result, the records will languish. A forgotten story is a forgotten people. For the last several years, the archival profession has been at the center of increasing critiques that argue its failure to provide access to archives that are inclusive of narratives that reflect the totality of its truths. It has been labeled as a safe harbor for those who are the progenitors of anti-Blackness, as a tool for the continuation of harmful propaganda, for centering powerful over the powerless, for the oppressor over the oppressed. The ability to engage in discourse over shared experiences, which you are enjoying this weekend with each other, validating one another's existence, pain, memories, fear, triumphs, and uncertainty, That is a powerful act, what we witnessed this morning. These histories, specifically of the anti-war movement, are well documented within academic and non-academic organizations around the country and can be found in catalogs across the pond. And as a result, solidifies the humanity of those activists, predominantly in a white movement. But I too sing America. In the words of one of the nation's great literary artists, Langston Hughes. When I started at Kent State, I received a couple of inquiries. Where were the black students during the Kent State shootings? I did not know that off the top of my head. But I actually did remember when I started working there as a grad student, actually, coming across images and not seeing people of color easily identified or seeing that they had participated. So as I said, I didn't have an immediate response, and when I began to investigate this question, it became clear that this history was not interwoven or entrenched within the Kent State shootings narrative. As I poured through the archival records within our holdings, I began to reach out informally to Black alumni. I learned another movement was taking place in parallel to the anti-war protests, the Black Campus Movement. Dr. Ibram Kendi, which if you do not know Dr. Ibram Kendi, please read Dr. Ibram Kendi. He's amazing. He's a New York Times best-selling author, and he just wrote Stamped from the Beginning. But the book that I know him best is a published book in 2012 about the Black Campus Movement, where he looked at the height of this revolution that was occurring 1965 to 1972, around the same time as the push began for the Vietnam War. The BCM demanded validation of the Black experience through educational development, the creation of cultural centers, which is what we're celebrating again this weekend, diverse student programming, and an increase in Black students, faculty, and staff. University of Illinois, students joined the fray by challenging the administration to establish a Black cultural center and Black studies department, to employ more Black residence hall counselors, and to hire hundreds of Black professors. The groundswell of activism continued until approximately 1,000 colleges and universities faced demands meant to destabilize the institutionalized racism that had infiltrated the policies and was seen as an unjust and destructive to the academic experience of Black students. This arm of the Black Power movement that breached the walls of the academy impacted the orientation of institutions and changed the trajectory of campuses from coast to coast. I wanted to know how that story appeared at Kent State. So I did something radical in the context of traditional archives. I decided to engage in outreach where my sole purpose, where I intended to center the voice of the underdocumented, the disenfranchised. I began actively reclaiming the narratives of people of color, more specifically African American alumni, and interjecting that historiography, for whatever remains, into the university's institutional memory. This effort began in the fall of 2013, where I focused on acquiring photographs, correspondence, oral histories, and documentation that reflected and caused reflection and analysis of activism at Kent State. My first acquisition was a collection of more than 1,000 images, prints, and negatives of Black student life at Kent State from Lafayette Tolliver, a Black alumnus. It was the most significant collection of images on this subject within the institution's holdings. I advocated for an exhibition on behalf of the donor. I supported and utilized this content during instruction with faculty. I digitized images and worked with alumni using a participatory model to acquire descriptions for all the images. As I continued on this path of radical archiving, I was able to answer the question, where were the Black students during the May 4th protests after the announcement of the Cambodian invasion by President Nixon? And it was not that Black students were not involved at all at Kent State on this subject. As you all know, there were so many African Americans who were part of that first wave that went and were part of the Vietnam War. So they had skin in the game, literally. They were present during fall moratoriums on the Vietnam War. There are images of their participation and speeches regarding demonstrations, but as announcements of the pending May 4 rally spread, the leadership of Kent State's Black United Students, known as BUS, put out a call requesting that Black students stay away from the rally. "This is not our war," said the president at the time, Erwin Blunt. The invisibility or absence of Black students from the majority of the hundreds, if not thousands, of images taken on May 4 and the days leading up to the anti-war rally tell a specific narrative, one that shared cultural experiences among students of color who were keenly aware of the risk of being wounded or killed. There is an unspoken rationalization that occurs where there's a potential for violence, a conscious fear for people of color that is historically rooted and bears out in events like the Orangeburg Massacre. On May 4, 1970, the Black Campus Movement and the anti-war movement at Kent State were no longer two worlds, but one. The primarily white anti-war movement suffered in a way that had not been felt before, yet it was familiar territory for the Black student activists at Kent State, who were already privy to a network of realities at other institutions that mirrored what their white classmates at Kent State were already enduring. These histories matter. Our humanity matters. Pushing primarily white narratives for which represented the majority of the story of May 4, I acknowledged and assigned priority for processing and making accessible these stories. I assisted in positioning these voices to be the most prominent within the university's story, and thereby leaving the disenfranchised, historically oppressed student populations facing violence in the form of anti-Blackness, homophobia, ableism, and other forms of hatred in the shadows. I, too, was a conspirator in that manner. But just as I showed up for the lives of those who lived through the turmoil of those shootings, I needed to show up for my own humanity and for the humanity of others who had been denied a space, whose positionality had been overlooked, who had been given little to no valuation within the institutional record. During my tenure at Kent, I watched some of the students respond to the death of Michael Brown and the Ferguson uprising. And there was an outpour of demands with the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Atlantic in 2015 even did a piece called The Renaissance of Student Activism, saying that due to the resurgence of protests and demonstrations that were quickly flooding the campuses. And then in the post-haze of the 2016 election, students from various backgrounds responded to what many saw as a failure in democracy. My Twitter feed gave me insight into what was happening at campuses, and I wondered if this was being documented.
We on the freedom side. What side are you on? We on the freedom side. Yes, you as the freedom fighters, and they call
Say what? We don't fight.
I also knew that many of the student groups who were on the ground were from communities that had contentious relationships within academia. How do we document what is taking place now? And especially with groups who historically have had complicated relationships within the institution. I wanted to know if history was literally repeating itself. Were archives making the same mistakes of our past? Were the archives documenting these movements? The students who were risking their lives to stop the Dakota Access Pipeline, the students organizing in Chicago demanding action against police brutality or sexual violence or anti-immigration policies. So I reached out to Tamar Schutz, the university archivist at Ohio State University, the Ohio State University, and asked if she had similar questions and struggles, and wondered if we could create an online space that would centralize primary resources at institutions about student activism, with a specific focus on vulnerable identities. And from this conversation, with additional of rapid fire emails, Project STAND was born. Student Activism Now Documented. Project STAND is a radical grassroots archival consortia project between colleges and universities around the country to create a centralized digital space, highlighting analog and digital collections emphasizing student activism in marginalized communities. Project STAND aims to foster ethical documentation of contemporary and past social justice movements in underdocumented student populations. STAND also advocates for collections by collaborating with educators to provide pedagogical support, create digital resources, host workshops in the forums that Julie mentioned earlier. For information professionals, academics, technologists, humanists, everyone's invited. I'm interested in building communities with student organizers and their allies, leading to sustainable relationships and inclusive physical and digital spaces of accountability, diversity, and equity. The project officially launched in the summer of 2017. We now have over 60 institutions participating, from private to public, HBCUs and community colleges, institutions that have decided to begin to grapple with their archival praxis and advocate for the narratives within silenced communities. Last year, Project STAND, as it was mentioned earlier, received a grant from IMLS for $92,000 to host 4 forums around the country. The symposia have provided a platform where student organizers can share the stories of their labor, like you did with us today, where memory workers and archivists can engage in theories and concepts and deconstruct and rebuild approaches to building relationships with student activists fighting in social justice movements, movements meant to push this country. I said push this country to fulfill its promise of real democracy and ensuring the documentation of that labor is preserved. We have been honored to meet so many phenomenal young leaders, from Eva Dickerson at Clark State University, who has been organizing around ethical community development.
Spelman is an institution of women who do not wait for permission to change the world. Spelmanites are bold, passionate, determined, and have a clear vision of the impact they plan to make on their communities. My sisters have inspired me to break out past the gates of our campus and use my talents to serve and help empower a historic and legacy-filled neighborhood. Serving as Miss Spelman in the same city where Martin marched is a fiery call to action to do all that I can.
To read Puck at the University of Rhode Island, who's doing work around queer liberation. We have met activists at Chicago State University like Paris Griffin, who literally fought and wanted to keep the university open. That includes saving jobs of faculty, staff, and the education of students in 2016. We have also been honored to hear from other change agents such as Citali Alvarez at Harvard University, where they are pushing for Harvard to divest from prisons with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign. Charles Preston, one of the organizers for the Budget or Else campaign that also worked to save Chicago State University, said during his panel at CSU, quote, "It's so important to document our histories, especially if you're an activist or community organizer. Future generations need blueprints, references, and how-to guides. I believe it becomes more difficult to move and inform people when they don't know the history of resistance." End quote.
We have the power. Kuji Chakalia, self-determination. We have the power to recreate these systems, this world, as we see fit. And we're gonna fight racism. We're gonna fight gentrification. We're gonna fight divestment of black communities, blighted communities. We're gonna fight for our schools. We're gonna fight for funding with solidarity.
So how do I make sure our future can run the next mile of an infinite race towards social justice? I must take my opportunity as an archivist, as an activist, I'm an archivist activist, to make sure cultural heritage institutions, academic repositories, and other traditional archives look at the silences and not provide conjectures or apologies, but instead establish intentional means to assist in shaping memory, one that accounts for Latinx, trans, African American, differently abled, indigenous identities that deserve, no, actually require inclusion in this country's story of struggle, triumph, despair, innovation, war, peace, unity and division, perseverance, and as our friend earlier, and I don't know if he's still in here, please tell me your name again, that spoke on our panel today. Vince, yes. Vincent Wu. Hope. That is what I must do. Thank you.